So, I want to talk a little bit about the process of race and racialization. So, when we talk about racialization, we're talking about a process of how social status, behaviors, and even biological traits are perceived as aspects of racial inheritance. So in other words, these things are thought of as constructions of society that are depicted based upon race. In other words, in more simpler terms, race determines the amount of culture a person has. Culture being in quotations, the ability of someone to adapt in particular society, intelligence, all of these things get constructed as parts of race. This is sort of what is cultural behaviors, all of these things. And this is what we mean by the process of racialization, how those traits get sort of equated with racial categories, meaning that different people of different races have different sort of abilities, different sort of levels of cultural sophistication, cultural knowledge, intelligence. All these things are depicted based through these processes of racialization. Now, as we get from, Original Horseman and Race and Manifest Destiny, Audrey Smetley, and Race and the Construction of Human Identity, Lee Baker, and From Savage to Negro. All of these texts, highlight the ways in which these processes of racialization happen historically, right? And interestingly enough, it starts in sort of Europe with sort of the ability of European nations and cultures to describe one another as superior and inferior types of people. But these things are not written into law and sort of the conditions of society in a sense, in the same level where it was with African people, indigenous American people, Asian people, and other peoples around the world. And the reason why is because these are hardly distinguished. The differences between these people of European descent are hardly sort of recognizable across, unless we consider things like language and sort of particular aspects of culture. But physically, there were arguments about sort of physical differences, but these differences weren't as extreme or dramatic. And we don't want to also think about race as sort of just a separation of sort of physical differences, because it's way more than that. But the process of racialization works because it equates sort of these cultural and biological traits to racial groupings, and these types. These types become sort of more strict and defined in the New World, that being the Americas, because now you have sort of these different bodies and groups of people, enslaved Africans, you have American indigenous people, you have all these different sort of categories of people who are existing in the same society in a sense. And the early colonialists were trying to distinguish between people, one, because there was close relationship between indigenous Americans, Africans, and poor white people who may have been in indigenous service, and to sort of overcome sort of some of that fear by landowners and those people who had, sort of the power over the land, over sort of the economy and all of these different things, to distinguish them from these other classes of people was important, but also to create a distinction and a scale where these people were distinguished from each other was important as well, because, if you treat a bunch of people as if they're equal and you're superior to them, ideally they will rebel. Anyway, so what happens essentially is that slave labor, as we know, was important to the economy of the colonies. And so you start to see these laws and policies being written that gave and ascribed state of inferiority to enslaved Africans and just people of African descent in general, as well as other groups of people. But enslaved Africans was ascribed this status of being chattel slaves. And so with that being written into law and policy and things like that, there comes all these justifications along with it, like, eugenics and all these different things that sort of justify these systems of oppression by saying that these people are in need of our help. And it's our Christian duty, and this is this idea of manifest destiny. It's our Christian duty to sort of make this savage better, to make this uncivilized person better, to give them culture. And you have people like, like Samuel Morton, Joseph Knott, and these people who develop these ideas around cultural inferiority. And all of these things get written into systems of education, into systems of power, assistance of governance, and all these different institutions. And that becomes known as the basics of this process that we call racialization.